hand shot out and grabbed a wrist. Not a friendly grab. A lock. The kind meant to send a message. The man doing the grabbing was big. Military big. Thick through the chest. Wide through the shoulders. With the particular confidence of someone who had never been told no by his own body. The man whose wrist was taken said nothing. He didn't tense. He didn't step back. He just looked down at the hand wrapped around his wrist, then looked back up, calm as a man checking the time. What happened in the next 2 seconds would empty the room of sound. One moment, the big man was standing. The next, he was flat on his back on the floor, blinking at the ceiling, with no clear memory of the ground arriving. That was the day Steven Seagal grabbed Bruce Lee's wrist. Stay with me on this one. The year was 1973. Hollywood was in one of those strange, electric moments where the old world and the new one hadn't decided who was in charge yet. The studios were nervous. The action genre was changing. And the people who made action possible, the stunt coordinators, the fight choreographers, the technical directors, they were gathering for what one trade paper called a Martial Arts and Film Coordination Summit. In a rented conference room at a hotel in Burbank. It sounds modest. It wasn't. The names in that room were not modest names. Bruce Lee was there. He was 32 years old, barely 5'7", and he walked into rooms the way very few people walk into any room. Not like he owned it, but like the room had been waiting for him. He wasn't putting that on. That was just what happened. People turned. Conversations stopped. They started back up again immediately, because nobody wanted Bruce Lee to catch them staring. But they all looked. The other man you need to know about came in 20 minutes late. Steven Seagal was 22. He had trained in Japan for 5 years in Aikido and had come back to Los Angeles with the absolute conviction that he had found something most Americans hadn't. He wasn't wrong about the Aikido. He was wrong about a few other things. He was tall, 6'4", good-looking in a way that he was very aware of. He had a ponytail before ponytails were something men his size wore, and he wore it like a statement. His manager, a wiry, nervous man named Danny Cho, followed him everywhere like a man who had agreed to hold a lit torch in a dry forest. "You see him?" Seagal said to Danny the moment they walked in. He wasn't asking because he needed help looking. He was making a point. "I see him," Danny said. "Smaller than I thought." Danny looked at Bruce Lee across the room and said nothing, because Danny had grown up watching Bruce Lee move, and he knew that size had nothing to do with anything. "I could take him," Seagal said. This was not a threat. This was Steven Seagal's way of processing the world. If a man was in the room, the first question was always, could he take him? He worked through the roster the way some men work through sports stats. The answer for Seagal was almost always yes. Danny said, "Please don't." The summit was a professional event. There were panels, demonstrations, polite but heated arguments about the difference between stage combat and real technique, about what the camera forgave and what it exposed. Bruce Lee participated in these conversations with a precise, spare economy. He said exactly what he meant and stopped when he meant it. Other people in the room were performing expertise. Bruce Lee was demonstrating it. Seagal, to his credit, was not stupid. He watched. He listened, more than he usually did. He was, underneath the confidence, someone who genuinely loved what he practiced. Aikido was real to him. The philosophy of it, the way it redirected force instead of meeting it head-on, was something he actually believed in. The problem was that he believed in it the way some people believe in a religion they've never been tested on. He spent the first hour of the summit watching Bruce Lee from across the room. He told Danny he was studying him. Danny believed this in the same way he believed everything Seagal said, carefully and only partway. During the lunch break, the room broke apart into clusters. People refilling coffee, comparing notes, trading cards. Bruce Lee was standing near a window at the edge of the room, talking quietly with Jim Kelly, who had just rapped Enter the Dragon. They were relaxed, easy, the kind of quiet that comes from people who don't need to prove anything to each other. Seagal saw the opening. He said to Danny, "Watch this." Danny said, "Steven, Steven, don't." But he was already moving across the room, and Danny stood there alone with his coffee cup and a very specific feeling he had learned to recognize over 18 months of working for Steven Seagal. It was the feeling of something about to happen that he was going to have to explain later. He crossed the room with the confidence of a man who had already won the conversation he hadn't started yet. Bruce Lee noticed him coming. Jim Kelly noticed him coming. Most people in the room noticed him coming because Seagal moved through space the way certain people do, with a physical certainty that pulled attention. He was aware of this about himself. He liked it. He stopped 2 feet from Bruce Lee, and the first thing he said was, "I've been watching your form." Bruce Lee looked at him, not with hostility, not with suspicion, just with attention, the way a man pays attention to something he hasn't categorized yet. "Steven Seagal," Seagal said, extending his hand. "Aikido, Japan. 5 years." Bruce Lee shook his hand. He didn't say his own name. He didn't need to. "I want to show you something," Seagal said. "A wrist lock. You've probably seen variations. But the Aikido application is different. The angle of entry, the way it redirects." "Sure," Bruce Lee said. That was it. Just sure. No challenge. No caution. He offered his arm. Now here's the thing. Seagal was not faking. He knew what he was doing. The lock he intended to apply was real. He had drilled it thousands of times in an Osaka dojo. He had applied it on men bigger than him, stronger than him, men who knew it was coming. He was genuinely good. He reached out, wrapped both hands around Bruce Lee's wrist, and began to apply the lock. In the space of one breath, less than one breath, the wrist wasn't there anymore. It's very hard to describe what happened next in a way that makes physical sense, because it didn't happen in a sequence. It happened all at once. The wrist rotated. Something shifted in Seagal's elbow. Center of balance, which he had positioned carefully, evaporated. And then his back was hitting the carpet, and the air came out of him, and he was staring at the ceiling tiles. He lay there for a moment. The room had gone quiet. Bruce Lee was standing above him, not triumphant, not amused, not anything particular. He just looked down the way you look at a problem you've solved, with a kind of neutral completeness. "The angle of entry was wrong," Bruce Lee said, and then he offered his hand. Seagal took it. He got up. He adjusted his jacket. He nodded, once, with great seriousness, as if receiving valuable technical feedback. And then he walked back across the room to Danny. Danny said nothing. He handed Seagal his coffee cup. Seagal accepted it, drank from it, and stared at the middle distance. "Fluke," he said. Danny looked at him. "The carpet," Seagal said. "My footing was off." Danny nodded slowly. "Second attempt, completely different outcome." "Sure," said Danny. "I mean that." "I know you do," said Danny, who absolutely did not believe it. The afternoon session continued. Panels resumed. People asked questions about camera angles and fight choreography and the difference between a real block and a cinematic one. Seagal participated professionally. He was sharp. He knew his material. Nobody brought up what had happened. Bruce Lee did not bring it up. He had already moved on. He was fully engaged in a conversation about footwork with a choreographer from Warner Brothers. For Bruce Lee, the floor event had lasted 2 seconds and was now categorically over. For Seagal, it was still happening. But he kept that internal. That evening, Seagal and Danny ate dinner at the hotel restaurant. Seagal ordered the steak. He talked about the summit, about the other attendees, about the state of American Aikido, about a film project he was developing, about the importance of authentic martial arts representation in cinema. He was animated. He was funny even. Danny laughed at the right moments. The wine was good. The steak was good. Halfway through dessert, Seagal leaned back in his chair and said, "Tomorrow's going to be a solid day." Danny looked at him. Yeah. He picked up his fork. Fresh start. Clean slate. Danny actually genuinely relaxed. He thought, it's over. The man took a fall, he processed it over a steak dinner, and he's moving on. That's growth. Maybe they were turning a corner. He raised his glass. To the summit. To the summit, Seagal said. They clinked glasses. Danny thought, tomorrow will be fine. It was not fine. The trigger came at 7:45 the next morning, in the lobby, while Seagal was getting coffee from the cart near the elevator. He wasn't trying to listen, but he heard one stunt coordinator say to another, that Aikido guy yesterday, the one Lee put on the floor, and both of them chuckled, and then the elevator opened, and they stepped in. That was it. That was the whole thing. But Seagal had heard everything he needed to hear. That Aikido guy. Not his name. Not Seagal. Not the guy from Osaka. Just that Aikido guy. He was a category. He was a footnote to someone else's morning conversation. He walked back to Danny's room and knocked on the door at 7:53. Danny opened it in his undershirt, holding a toothbrush. Seagal said, Bruce Lee doesn't remember my name. Danny said, good morning. I need to know if that's true. Steven. Find out. This is where it turns. Because up until this point, Seagal's problem was embarrassment. That's manageable. People get embarrassed. They recover. But the moment he heard those two men in the lobby, the problem changed shape entirely. It wasn't about the fall anymore. It was about invisibility. You have to understand something about Seagal, and I'll be fair to him here. He was genuinely someone. In the Aikido world, in certain circles in Japan, his reputation was real. He had earned it. He had spent 5 years in a foreign country, in a discipline that rejected shortcuts, training until his hands bled. He was not nothing. He had never been nothing. And yet here, in this hotel in Burbank, he was that Aikido guy. Danny tried to de-escalate. He pointed out that Bruce Lee had met 50 people at this summit. He pointed out that Seagal had met 50 people too and couldn't name half of them. He pointed out that being remembered by Bruce Lee was not a professional requirement. He laid all of this out very clearly, over a room service breakfast, while Seagal ate nothing and stared at the table. Seagal waited for Danny to finish. Then he said, I want a rematch. Danny put down his fork. Not a fight, Seagal said quickly. A demonstration. A formal exchange. On neutral terms, with clear conditions. I apply a technique. He applies a technique. It's collaborative. Educational. Both of us benefit. Danny said, he's not going to agree to that. You don't know that. I know that. Set up the meeting. Danny looked at him for a long moment. Then he picked his fork back up and started eating again, because there was nothing left to say, and the eggs were getting cold. The plan that followed was objectively a disaster. But it was a disaster with ambition, which is its own kind of thing. Seagal's first move was to find allies. He worked the morning session with a focus Danny had never seen him apply to anything legitimate. He pulled aside stunt coordinators from the day before. He had conversations that started with professional technique and ended with Seagal carefully explaining that he had identified some areas for mutual growth with Bruce Lee and was hoping to arrange a private demonstration. Nobody agreed to help him, but they agreed not to actively stop him. For Seagal, that counted. His second move was subtler. He began positioning himself near Bruce Lee at every opportunity, not confrontationally, but adjacently. At breaks, during lunch. He asked pointed questions during the panel sessions, smart questions, questions that demonstrated knowledge and precision. The kind of questions Bruce Lee might notice. Bruce Lee noticed the questions. He did not visibly notice Seagal. His third move was to write a note. An actual handwritten note, on hotel stationery. Danny watched him draft it 4 times. The final version was 3 sentences. It proposed a technical exchange the following morning, suggested a time and location, and signed with respectfully, S. Seagal, Aikido 5th Dan. He gave it to a bellhop to deliver. They waited. 45 minutes later, Bruce Lee found Seagal during the afternoon coffee break. And here's the first real payoff of this story. Because Bruce Lee was not dismissive. He was not performing cool. He was not carrying anything from the day before. He looked at Seagal and said, with no trace of mockery, "I got your note. I'd be happy to work with you tomorrow. 7 a.m. in the exercise room." Seagal said yes. Danny said nothing because he was calculating whether he could check out and drive to San Francisco before 7 a.m. He couldn't. If you're still with me on this one, hit that subscribe button. There is a lot more where this came from. 7 a.m. Seagal was in the exercise room at 6:45. He had slept 4 hours. He had stretched for 20 minutes. He had changed into his Aikido GI and then changed out of it into training clothes and then back into the GI. He had a very specific idea of how this morning was going to look, and the GI was part of it. Danny sat in the corner on a folding chair with a cup of coffee and the expression of a man attending a funeral for someone he cared about. Bruce Lee arrived at 7 on the dot. Not 6:59. Not 7:01. Exactly 7. He was wearing gray pants and a white t-shirt and carrying nothing. He looked at the room, said morning, and began to stretch. Seagal watched him stretch. Bruce Lee's warm-up was quiet and methodical and utterly without performance. He was not demonstrating. He was preparing. There's a difference, and it's visible, and Seagal could see it, and something about it made him stand up a little straighter. "Appreciate you making time," Seagal said. "Of course," Bruce Lee said, still moving through his stretch. "You train every day?" "Every day." "Good." He stood up. He looked at Seagal directly, with a focus that had nothing aggressive in it and everything serious. "What did you want to work on?" This was Seagal's moment. He had thought about it all night. He had a whole speech prepared. It began with a brief history of Aikido's philosophical foundations, moved into a discussion of redirection as a combat principle, and concluded with a respectful challenge that left Bruce Lee the option of declining gracefully. What came out was, "I want to show you the lock from yesterday." Bruce Lee nodded. "Okay. I want to do it right this time." Bruce Lee nodded again. No condescension. No smile. He said, "Okay," and offered his wrist. Seagal took a breath. He positioned his feet. He thought about the angle. He reached out and took Bruce Lee's wrist. He applied the lock. He applied it perfectly. He knew the moment his hands closed that his position was right, his angle was right, his weight distribution was correct. This was the technique as drilled. This was the real thing. And nothing happened. The wrist didn't move. Seagal pressed. The wrist didn't move. He shifted his weight. The wrist didn't move. He applied more force and felt, from somewhere in Bruce Lee's arm, a quiet, absolute resistance that wasn't resistance at all. It was stillness, like pushing against something that had decided not to exist in the direction you were pushing. Seagal stood there with both hands wrapped around a wrist that wasn't doing what wrists were supposed to do. And then Bruce Lee said, quietly, "Relax your thumbs." Seagal relaxed his thumbs. The lock fell apart immediately, not because it was released, because the adjustment had changed the entire structural geometry of what he was doing, and now he could see, in his own hands, exactly why. The lock required the thumbs at a specific angle relative to the ulnar nerve. He had been off by something small, something that shouldn't have mattered but did. "Try again," Bruce Lee said. He tried again. This time the lock engaged. He could feel it real, present, a genuine mechanical advantage. He looked up and Bruce Lee was nodding. One small nod. The nod of a teacher confirming that a student has found the right answer. And then Bruce Lee moved. Not to counter the lock. Not to throw him. He just moved. A small rotation, something in the shoulder, a shift of weight, and the lock simply ceased to apply. Not because it had been broken, but because the geometry of it no longer existed. Seagal was still holding the wrist. There was just nothing to lock anymore. "The principle is sound," Bruce Lee said. "The application depends on the opponent not understanding their own structure. The moment they understand it, the lock dissolves. You have to enter earlier. He said this the way a plumber explains a pipe fitting. Matter of fact, patient, genuinely interested in the problem. And this is what did it. Not the technique. Not the takedown from the day before. Because Seagal had come into this room ready for a confrontation, and what he got was a lesson. He had come in armed for a fight, and Bruce Lee had offered him something worth considerably more. He had been ready to defend himself, and instead he had to stand there and receive the kind of direct, serious attention that Bruce Lee gave to things that interested him. Which meant Seagal interested him. Not as a threat, not as a curiosity, as a practitioner. Seagal said, "Okay." Then said it again, "Okay." They worked for an hour and 15 minutes. Bruce Lee corrected him 4 times. Each correction was specific and quiet and produced an immediate improvement. Seagal felt things shift in his understanding that he hadn't expected to shift. He was taking notes in his head so fast he was barely keeping up. At the end, Bruce Lee said, "You've got good instincts. The Aikido is real. The timing needs work." He said it the way you say something true that you expect will be useful. He shook Seagal's hand. He said, "Good session." And that was all. He left. Danny waited until the door had closed completely, then said, "Well." Seagal looked at the door for a long moment. "He's better than I thought," he said. Danny said, "Yes. Considerably better. Yes. I want to be clear," Seagal said, turning to Danny. "This conversation never happened." Danny said, "Absolutely. But I'm going to think about what he said." "That's good, Stephen. About the thumbs." "Sure. I'm going to think about it a lot." Here's the thing about Steven Seagal. He went on to have a career. A real one. The action films came, and then more films, and eventually the persona he had been building since that hotel in Burbank became famous enough that most people assumed he had invented himself fully formed. The ponytail, the quiet menace, the Aikido, all of it went on screen and it worked. He never talked publicly about 1973. He talked about Bruce Lee in interviews once or twice in the years that followed. He was always respectful. He called him a consummate martial artist. He said, with great solemnity, that Bruce Lee was ahead of his time. These were things you could say about Bruce Lee that revealed absolutely nothing about yourself. He never mentioned the wrist. Danny Cho managed Seagal through most of the 70s, then eventually left the entertainment business and opened a restaurant in Pasadena that reviewers said had excellent dim sum. He never talked about the summit either. Partly because of something he had signed. Partly because he had made a private decision, sometime in the car ride back from Burbank, that some things were better left in the room. But he thought about it. Specifically, he thought about the moment in the exercise room when Bruce Lee looked at Seagal, really looked at him, and corrected his thumb placement. Because Danny had watched a lot of people interact with Seagal over the years, and most of them, even people who liked him, eventually adjusted. They worked around the ego the way you work around a structural column. You don't move it, you build the room around it. It becomes part of the architecture. Bruce Lee hadn't done that. He had just talked to Seagal like a person who had a solvable problem and the capacity to solve it. Believe me, that was rare. For Seagal, the summit stayed with him longer than he would ever admit. Not the fall. Not the embarrassment. The hour and 15 minutes. He drilled the wrist lock that afternoon, alone in the exercise room after everyone had gone. He worked on the thumb position. He understood it now, actually understood it. In his hands, not just in his head. He spent 45 minutes on one small correction. That's not something an ego does. That's something a student does. I'm not telling you Seagal had some permanent transformation. He didn't. He went back to Los Angeles and continued being Steven Seagal, which is a full-time occupation with particular demands. But for a stretch of time after that, months, Danny thought he was quieter in rooms. He asked more questions. He corrected people less. It didn't last forever, but it lasted. Bruce Lee died 6 months later. July 20th, 1973. He was 32 years old, and the circumstances were sudden and unexpected and have been argued about in detail ever since. He never saw Enter the Dragon released in American theaters. He never knew what it would become. He also never mentioned Steven Seagal. Not to Jim Kelly. Not in any interview. Not in any of the notes or letters or writings that survived him. The hour in the exercise room was, for Bruce Lee, just a morning. A session with a young practitioner who had good instincts and needed to relax his thumbs. That's what hits hardest about this story, if you sit with it long enough. Not the fall. The fall is funny. The fall is the kind of thing you tell at dinner and everyone laughs and someone asks you to do the part about the carpet again. But the hour afterward, the fact that Bruce Lee gave Seagal a real hour of his real attention, with no ego in it, no performance, no score to settle, that's the thing. Because Seagal came into that room with everything to prove. His whole image was at stake. His sense of himself. He had been walking around for 24 hours with a wound he couldn't show anyone. And the man who had put him on the floor the day before greeted him at 7 a.m. in gray pants and corrected his thumb placement like it was the most natural thing in the world. That's the more devastating move. Not the throw. The patience. A hand shot out and grabbed a wrist. That's how this started. One man trying to establish something about himself by taking hold of another man's arm. What he got instead was a correction. A real one. The kind that requires someone to look at you honestly and tell you where you're wrong, without making it about anything other than the work. That's harder to receive than a throw. A throw you can explain away. A throw can be a fluke or a foothold or the carpet. But when someone looks at you and says, not unkindly, not triumphantly, just plainly, relax your thumbs. There is nowhere to put that except inside yourself, where it either becomes something useful or something bitter. Seagal, give him credit for this, he used it. Not perfectly. Not completely. Not in every room he ever walked into for the rest of his career. But in that exercise room, in that 45 minutes alone, with his hands wrapped around an invisible wrist, working one small correction over and over until he felt it land. He used it. Bruce Lee was already gone by the time Seagal understood what had really happened between them. And maybe that's the right ending for this kind of story. The lesson arrives. The teacher moves on. The student works it out alone. That's usually how it goes. Thanks for staying with me.